and we have a tremendous lineup of experts who are going to guide us on this topic. I'm thrilled to welcome not just FinCEN, but OFAC, and guided through this conversation by David Carlisle, who some of you ACFCS super fans out there may remember from past webinars, podcasts, other presentations. I think, David, actually some of the earliest sessions on crypto that I did were with you, and so you're sort of my early crypto guru in this space. So it's a pleasure to welcome you back and have you lead this conversation. I am Brian Spoda-Kindle with the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are and then step out of the way for most of this session. But please do type your questions, comments into the chat during this session. I do want to note that we are on Zoom for this presentation. Many of you who are familiar with ACFCS webinars are more familiar with On24. We are on Zoom to accommodate our government folks who were having a little bit of trouble with our On24 platform. Apparently, it's super sketchy for the government space. So we're on Zoom. It seems to be working fine. I'm sure you're familiar with Zoom, but rather than the Q&A feature that we normally use on webinars, we'll just be using the chat instead. So if you have a question, type it in the chat. We're going to be sharing some resources in the chat during the presentation. You can grab them there. We'll also follow up with resources in a follow-up email too. So be on the lookout for some great resources. We will try to respond to as many comments, questions as possible in the chat as well. We'll also be saving some time at the end for a dedicated Q&A. I'm sure you have many questions. We may have some answers. We may not have all the answers. And as a general disclaimer, the information being presented on this webinar is not government guidance. It is designed to be informational on these topics, but it neither supplants nor replaces your official guidance, and you should always refer back to that in your relevant jurisdiction. We have looks like over 600 participants on this session. We had well over 1,000 registrants, really from all around the world. I think that speaks to the global scope of this challenge and the global nature of the response, which is very encouraging. And I'm glad that you are here to tune in. Special thanks to Elliptic for putting this great session together. And special thanks, as always, to our members and CFCS certified professionals. We, as mentioned, are a membership association. We cover the full spectrum of financial crime risk. We offer member benefits, including training resources, a really in-depth webinar archive, news and analysis. We administer the CFCS, or Certified Financial Crime Specialist credential. We're the only credential out there that covers the full spectrum of financial crime risk. We offer live events. We're back with live events in 2022, very exciting, which I may tell you a little bit more about at the end if we have some time, as well as a number of virtual events throughout the year as well. And as mentioned, we cover really the full spectrum of financial crime, and really, rather than just kind of throwing information at you about money laundering, fraud, sanctions evasion, so on and so forth, we try to cover issues that cut across all of these topics. I think the use of cryptocurrency, partly because it's so new, is absolutely one of those areas. So very glad to bring you some guidance, maybe potentially dispel some myths on this topic. And on that note, I do want to throw a poll out there just to get your thoughts. And the poll is simply, do you think that Russian entities, individuals subject to sanctions are using cryptocurrencies to evade sanctions? You can say yes on a large scale, yes only on a small scale, no, not in a meaningful way, or you tell me, you're the experts. Or if you think something else, go ahead and tell us the answer in the chat too. So that poll should be popping up on the screen. Go ahead and respond to that while I finish up the introduction here. As mentioned, we are a membership association, so we have chapters all over the world. This is just a snapshot of them here. Encourage you to learn more about all of our chapters and consider joining. Visit our website, acfcs.org, to learn more about everything we have to offer. I won't bore you with all the details. I don't think, not that ACFS is boring, but you know what I mean. I don't think too many people need troubleshooting tips on Zoom, but just in case you run into any issues, try closing out other applications. Might be a system resource issue. You can try closing out and rejoining. If you're using this in a browser tab, Chrome or Firefox are the recommended tabs for Zoom. If you're using it in a standalone application, that obviously doesn't apply. So If you're an ACFCS member or a CFCS certified professional, your certificate of participation will be available in our learning portal. Give us about 3 days to get this uploaded. This session is being recorded. It will be available on an ongoing basis, along with the slide deck for members. There will be a short survey at the end. Definitely fill that out. Let us know your thoughts, feedback, topic for future sessions. And as a reminder, please type your questions into the chat. I see some already coming in. That's great. And I'm going to close out this poll and actually share the results right now. So last chance on the poll here. Looks like we have a ton of responses that came in. And let's share the results back here. So 56% say yes, that Russian entities, individuals are using on a large scale crypto to evade sanctions. 29% yes, but only on a small scale. Only 4 say no, not in any meaningful way, and 11% just are here to hear from the experts. So I'm very interested to hear from our panelists on what they think about those poll results. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But before we get there, I do want to introduce David Carlisle. He's the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Elliptic. And he is a real expert in this space. He actually comes from the Treasury, if I'm not mistaken, as well as roles at FinTrail and RUSI, some very illustrious UK-based organizations, and really just a true expert in the crypto space. So we're thrilled to have him here, and we're thrilled to have him lead this topic. With that, I'm going to turn it over to him, let him briefly introduce our other panelists, and take it away from there. So David, thanks again for being here.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian. And yeah, thanks for having me again here. It's good to be back with the ACFCS membership, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So as Brian mentioned, I'm David Carlisle, the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Elliptic. For those of you who may not be familiar with Elliptic, we're a blockchain analytics company and provider of compliance and risk management services related to crypto assets. So we provide crypto asset exchanges and financial institutions like banks with solutions they can use to detect crypto asset related risks and ensure compliance with regulatory requirements, such as those related to sanctions. I think obviously, everyone on the call today, I think is probably aware of the really extraordinary amount of activity over the past several weeks when it comes to Russia sanctions. In just a matter of days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and other countries around the world imposed really sweeping restrictions on Russia that are remarkable in terms of their speed of implementation. I think it took probably, a decade or so to impose sanctions of that breadth on Iran. So the past few weeks or a couple of months have really been extraordinary in terms of the scope of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in such a short time. And with that activity, inevitably, concerns have been raised over how Russia might look to evade the very severe restrictions it now faces. And one set of concerns revolves around whether crypto assets, such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others, might be leveraged by Russia or by sanctioned persons there to evade restrictions and seek alternative methods of value transfer outside of the banking system. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at what are some of the regulatory considerations that exist when it comes to enforcing sanctions within the world of crypto assets. What's the prospect of sanctions evasion via crypto? What does that mean for private sector compliance and the expectation on compliance teams? It's a very exciting topic for me personally. As Brian mentioned, I did work at the U.S. Treasury myself in the past and at OFAC specifically many moons ago before joining Elliptic, but my own background's in sanctions policy. So I personally think this is just a really fascinating topic. And to assist us in that today, we have 2 really outstanding guests joining us. I think it really goes without saying we couldn't have 2 better people to help guide us through this topic today. Joined by Kevin O'Connor from the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crime Enforcement Network, and Lawrencescheiner of OFAC, of the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And so great to have them here today to talk about the work they're doing on this topic. Perhaps before we get into the substance, Kevin and Lawrence, maybe you could just briefly introduce yourselves to the audience and describe the work you do at your respective organizations, then we'll get into the substance. So Kevin, should we start with you?
Sure. Hi, thank you so much, David, and thank you to Brian and to the ACFCS for having me here today. It's really excited. I get really excited when I get to talk to compliance professionals and people in this space. So I love this subject. This is a great panel. I'm very excited. I'm Kevin O'Connor. I'm the Section Chief for Virtual Assets and Emerging Technology in FinCENs Enforcement and Compliance Division. And so what that means is we're the team of experts that look specifically at how virtual asset service providers are meeting their obligations to comply with U.S. anti-money laundering laws. And so we were the ones that would, work with examiners to help ensure they're meeting compliance objectives, and then taking enforcement actions on the civil side when there's non-compliance that's identified. So I'm really excited to be with you here today and to sort of dive into this subject matter. Lawrence?
Well, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Lawrencescheiner, Associate Director for Compliance and Enforcement at OFAC. And David, Brian, thank you so much for setting this up and having us. It's really a pleasure to be here. So as the Associate Director for Compliance and Enforcement, I oversee the offices of enforcement and compliance, as the name implies. On the compliance side, we lead the private sector outreach for OFAC, so engage with the private sector, including the crypto industry. So for us, this is very exciting to hear what some of the questions are, where guidance can be helpful, where clarity can be helpful. That's something we're very interested in on the compliance side. And on the enforcement side, this is the office that also has brought some of the recent enforcement actions in the crypto space. So all that is to say, very, very glad to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thanks so much to you both, and especially for joining us and everyone here. What I'm sure is a very busy time for you both, so we really do appreciate it. Now, so really just to get into the meat of things, let's start with just looking at how the U.S. sanctions response it intersects with the crypto space and what its implications are for crypto assets and businesses that might handle them. Obviously, it goes without saying that the U.S. has now taken a number of significant sanctions actions targeting Russia and Russian individuals and entities since late February, especially. So maybe Lawrence, you could maybe provide it'd be great if you could provide the OFAC perspective there in terms of what the implications of those sanctions are for transactions and business involving crypto assets. And maybe what the picture is in terms of the scope of those sanctions and how they impact the crypto space.
Yeah, happy to. So let me start first with an overview of our recent Russia actions and then talk about how specifically it implicates the crypto sector. So at a very high level, David, as you noted, we've taken a series of unprecedented actions over the last several weeks related to Russia. And that includes sanctioning Russia's largest banks, immobilizing the assets of the central bank, targeting dozens of oligarchs, prohibiting new investment in Russia, among many other prohibitions. And one of the key messages that we've been conveying to this industry is that these sanctions apply to all U.S. persons, right, including those in the crypto space. And we actually issued guidance specific to this point, basically addressing the question of whether these sanctions apply to those in the crypto space. And it's a very clear answer. The answer is yes. All U.S. persons are required to comply with OFAC regulations, right? And that goes without saying, regardless of whether the transaction is denominated in fiat currency or virtual currency. And what we say in that guidance is that U.S. persons, including virtual currency exchanges and other service providers in this space, are generally prohibited from engaging in or facilitating prohibited transactions. And that includes virtual currency transactions where a sanctioned bank or other person may have an interest, right? The other thing we note in the guidance that I think is important to highlight is that U.S. persons, U.S. exchangers cannot help a foreign person or foreign exchange do something that the U.S. person cannot do themselves. What that means is that a U.S. exchange cannot help a foreign exchange do something that the U.S. exchange couldn't do themselves. That's called prohibited facilitation, and so we issued guidance to emphasize that point. And I think that also brings up another important point to emphasize for this group is with respect to foreign exchanges. While our regulations apply to U.S. persons, I think it's important to note that foreign virtual currency exchanges, they also need to be attuned to OFAC regulations because they too could be liable under our regulations if they cause a U.S. person, for example, to violate our sanctions. I would also note too that the executive order that we've been using recently to issue these sanctions also has a specific provision that allows us to target entities that help circumvent U.S. sanctions, right, including by using virtual currencies, typically the order. So that's another area to highlight. I think the bottom line really is to emphasize that those in the virtual currency space, domestic as well as foreign, really need to be vigilant against attempts to circumvent OFAC regulations and should take a risk-based approach to ensure that they're not engaging in prohibited transactions, as there could be civil or criminal penalties that result from that. And then, of course, for our part on the OFAC side, we're closely monitoring any efforts to circumvent our sanctions in the Russia space, including through the use of virtual currency, as some of our recent actions have highlighted.
Great, thanks for that overview. And I think one thing that's also really interesting is the work that OFAC's done to date to try to facilitate compliance by the virtual currency industry by publishing virtual currency addresses of sanctioned actors on its SDN list. For those who may not be familiar, OFAC's taken a number of actions over the past couple of years where it's actually included Bitcoin addresses and other cryptocurrency addresses belonging to SDNs as a way of helping businesses identify potential transactions with those entities. And most recently, this came up on April 5th, where OFAC sanctioned a large Russia-linked, Russian-based darknet market called Hydra and an Estonian crypto exchange called Garantex for their involvement in facilitating Russian cybercrime, where OFAC listed, I think, more than 100 crypto asset addresses belonging to those entities to enable compliance there. So, I mean, Lawrence, could you explain a little bit more about that? What is the significance of OFAC listing addresses, not just of Russian-based actors, but of sanctioned actors in this way? And what are OFAC's compliance expectations of U.S. person when it comes to leveraging this information as part of their compliance operations?
Yeah, David, that's a great question, because it sort of gets at the broader purpose as to why we take these actions in the first place, right? To raise the compliance bar across the industry. So if you look at the recent action against Garantex, for example, that action really builds upon other recent sanctions actions against other virtual currency exchanges like SUEX and ChatX that we took late last year. And what these cases show is that when exchanges like these disregard their AML, CFT, or sanctions obligations, they allow their systems to be abused by illicit actors, right? And that can undermine U.S. foreign policy and national security interests. So the OFAC takes these actions not just to disrupt a particular actor or illicit activities, which of course is important in its own right, but more broadly, they shine a light on how important it is for the virtual currency industry, both in the U.S. and abroad, to implement effective AML, CFT, and sanctions controls, and what can happen if they do that. Really, like I said, the point is to raise the compliance bar across the industry. And part of that compliance guidance that we want to issue out there is including the virtual currency addresses that are associated with the activity that we sanction, right? So as you noted, OFAC identified over 100 virtual currency addresses in the Garantex action. And the reason we do that is because it allows the private sector to more easily screen and prevent virtual currency transactions associated with persons. So there's a few things that I think could be helpful for firms to do once we do that. First, as a baseline, virtual currency firms should employ tools to identify and block these addresses. That's sort of like the baseline step that can be helpful for firms to take, right? But going a layer deeper, that information, the virtual currency addresses that we identify, can be helpful for firms in identifying other addresses that we may not have listed, but could also pose sanctions risk, right? So if you have a listed address that shares a wallet with an unlisted address, you might want to look at that unlisted address to assess whether that also poses sanctions risk, because that could be indicative of a blocked person also having an interest in those transactions. So that's an example of how you can use that information to better inform your risk assessment and then implement controls. Another thing that we found helpful that some firms do is conduct a historic look back on activity related to those addresses. So once we put an address out there, what we know some firms do, which is really helpful, is take that address and then look back historically to see who else has transacted with that address to be listed, right? What are the nature of those transactions? Is there something about those transactions that can also give insight into potential sanctions risk that the firm may want to identify and take steps to mitigate? And what is also very helpful for us is when if firms do that and they identify addresses that we may not have listed, but they provide that to us through suspicious activity reports or things like that that Kevin can talk about, we can then take that information, and if it makes sense to update our list with those addresses, it creates a positive feedback loop where we're putting more information out there. The industry can identify useful information and share that back with us, and we can keep that cycle going in a positive way that helps both us and the private sector.
Oh, great, thanks. It's a really thorough response, and I think also just shows that those types of indicators can be incredibly powerful, as simple as they may seem, just to kind of publish there on the OFAC SDN list, but they can be really powerful tools for the private sector to leverage in compliance. we'll turn to the sort of FinCEN perspective in just a minute, but before we kind of get onto that, just want to turn this to the discussion of sanctions evasion and the prospect for sanctions evasion by Russia, using crypto assets. How do you perceive some of that risk, and how do you see the question of, could Russia itself as a country use crypto to evade sanctions, or could, say, sanctioned oligarchs do it? Is it a concern at OFAC, and how are you thinking about that?
Sure, it's a good question. And I think breaking it down between the micro and macro levels is sort of helpful, right? So if you start with the micro, Treasury does remain concerned at a micro individual level that oligarchs and cronies are going to use every method available to them to evade sanctions, right? Crypto being on a long list. And that's one of the reasons we issued the FAQ that I was talking about earlier, that guidance that describes some of the risks. And as we talk about the Hydra and Garantex action, Treasury has the tools to both monitor for this and act to close down evasion avenues. And Garantex is a good example, right? Given its Moscow location, its scale, the fact that Garantex transacts in rubles, we move quickly to cut it off before it becomes a significant sanctions evasion option. One of the things that I think is important to highlight too is that to complement these targeting efforts, right, highlighting these actors and sanctioning them, is prioritizing efforts on the enforcement and compliance side, again, sort of raising the bar across the industry to prevent the evasion from happening in the first place. And so on the compliance and enforcement side, I think, as you know, David, about 16 months ago, we took our first enforcement action related to the virtual currency space. We followed that up a few months later with another enforcement action. And a few months after that, we issued the 22-page virtual currency brochure that has very detailed guidance that virtual currency firms can use to enhance their compliance programs. And we highlight red flags in there for the industry to be alert to for potential sanctions. Now, at a macro level, Russia is a G20 fiat-based economy that has been damaged by our sanctions, right? And so you can't flip a switch overnight and run a G20 economy on crypto. And not only that, the use of virtual currency to purchase goods or services at that scale likely is going to require conversion to fiat currency through the use of financial institutions that should be subject to AML, CFT controls. But like I said, Treasury is definitely tracking the issue, and as our recent actions show, we'll act quickly to cut off evasion angles as we see them develop and ensure that the industry continues to enhance its sanctions compliance to prevent potential.
No, great. Thanks for that. Really interesting perspective. And we'll come on to it in just a moment, but I think, the other half of that too, very heavily involves some of FinCEN's own, authorities and remit in terms of, receiving information from the private sector about some of that potential activity, which we'll come on to just a second. Before we do that, I'm just going to share my screen quite quickly to just briefly to share some thoughts and observations that we have at Elliptic about the potential for Russian sanctions evasion through crypto. And let me just go ahead and expand my screen there, which may shed some light on some of the perspectives that were offered in the poll as well. So just want to share here some facts and figures and observations we have from Elliptic around some of our own perspective of how Russia sanctions evasion through crypto assets may or may not materialize, if the case may be. And just so I can check, is my screen visible? Are my slides visible? Great. I see you nodding there. So really, in the even days after some of the sanctions were imposed on Russia, there's immediate scrutiny, I think, from some very high-profile individuals, including, U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren, and the European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde, basically saying, we are very concerned that, given the scope of restrictions on its ability to access the U.S. dollar and the international financial system, Russia may look to crypto to skirt those sanctions and get around them. And I was like some really high-profile attention to that possibility. And in the days after the invasion, there was actually some activity that led some people to speculate that might have been happening really effectively immediately as the sanctions went into place. So here you can see on the screen some analysis we did at Elliptic based upon Bitcoin to ruble trading volumes on local Bitcoins, which is a very popular crypto exchange platform where you can exchange cash for crypto, and where they publish information about their ruble to Bitcoin trading volumes. And you can see that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think, was on the 22nd of February. And in the days after the invasion, Bitcoin to ruble trading volumes tripled on local Bitcoins for a period of time, which led some people to speculate, could that be oligarchs who are sanctioned trying to move their funds out of Russia? Could it be maybe the Russian government? Similarly, this is also based on published public data, but these are Bitcoin and ruble trading volumes on Binance, another popular exchange platform, but where we see a similar pattern, at least for a few days or a couple weeks after the invasion, where you can see that trading volumes were fairly low in Bitcoin and ruble trading in the days leading up to the invasion, but they approximately tripled for at least a period. And again, this led to a lot of speculation that maybe Russian individuals or entities on the sanctions list, or the Russian government itself is looking to maybe move funds from rubles into Bitcoin as a way of getting funds outside of Russia and skirting some of the banking restrictions. Now, I can say, despite what the most popular poll answer, certainly through the work we do at Elliptic, we've not seen concrete evidence necessarily that this activity was indicative of sanctions evasion. It's very possible that some of this was just ordinary Russians attempting to maybe bypass capital controls that were imposed by the Russian central bank. You can't conclusively rule out that some of it wasn't sanctions evasion, but there hasn't always been hard evidence. And so we really haven't seen concrete evidence of large-scale sanctions evasion taking place yet through crypto assets by the Russian government or by sanctioned individuals, entities on a sustained basis, certainly in any way. And I think that's not entirely surprising. I think Lawrence alluded to this a little bit, but here, just looking at some of the facts and figures, Russia has, at least as a couple of weeks ago, was the 11th largest economy in the world. I think it might be shrinking as we speak. But Russia is a very large economy. Its imports and exports annually are in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The total assets of its banking sector under sanctions are in excess of $1 trillion. But by comparison, the current market capitalization of all crypto assets, so the total value of all crypto assets in existence, is about $2 trillion. So, if you're the Russian government, you were really looking for some alternative rail on which to move your whole economy away from, say, the US and dollar and euro kind of dominated banking system. Crypto assets are really probably not a feasible way to do it. You'd probably need to find a way to leverage almost every unit of crypto asset in existence to really bypass sanctions on a very, very large and macro scale using crypto. I'm not necessarily saying impossible, but very, very challenging. And I think, there are a number of other factors there that present some challenges. There's probably not sufficient liquidity on most exchanges for Russia to move, say, hundreds of millions or hundreds of billions of dollars worth of crypto. There's limited use of crypto for payments and other services at mass scale, which can limit their utility for sanctions evasion. Crypto is very volatile, arguably less volatile right now than the Russian ruble, but still relatively volatile. Transactions are also quite transparent. We are at Elliptic able to trace a lot of what happens on the blockchain because of the transparency of transactions on the public ledger, which doesn't always make them an ideal tool for sanctions evasion. And we do also see that in certain jurisdictions, at least, like the US, the EU, UK, where sanctions have been imposed. Many virtual asset service providers, exchange services already do use sanctions compliance solutions like we created Elliptic to enable them to comply with OFAC sanctions. So, there are some ways in which, and I think factors that may limit the ability of Russia or sanctioned individual and entities to undertake very large scale sanctions evasion, very, very quickly. However, having said that, I think something we are very cognizant of at Elliptic and paying a lot of attention to is what I think is the very real prospect that, again, as Lawrence described, on a more micro scale, we might see sanctioned Russian individuals and entities, or maybe occasionally certain arms of the Russian government, look to crypto assets on a smaller scale to generate funds or lessen the impact of sanctions. And I think this is something we see, is common with any country or set of individuals and entities who are subject to sanctions, which, especially as those sanctions are sustained and they're feeling a lot of pressure, they'll start to look for really almost any method available to them to lessen the impact of the restrictions. And I think there's every reason to think that they will, Russian individuals and entities, and potentially the Russian government, will look to crypto as one workaround among many, and look to exploit maybe certain vulnerabilities there. And I won't go into these in extreme detail now, but there are a few ways we're monitoring at Elliptic where we're considering that Russia might attempt to evade sanctions using crypto. And this is based in part on things we've seen, especially other sanctioned nation states and actors do over time. So one potential method is through crypto asset mining. Crypto asset mining being the very energy intensive process of validating Bitcoin transactions, which results in the miner receiving rewards in the form of crypto asset payments being made to them. we've seen sanctioned nation states before, like Iran, look to Bitcoin mining on a meaningful scale to generate funds and potentially evade sanctions. In the case of Iran, we estimate that at least the scale of mining that occurs in Iran could generate up to $1 billion worth of revenue. Russia, being a very energy-intensive, energy-rich country, is well positioned to leverage Bitcoin mining potentially. And even over the past few months, a number of members of the Russian government have indicated as much, have said that they see a potential competitive advantage for Russia in leveraging Bitcoin mining. So that's one area of potential evasion. Another is cybercrime. So when it comes to kind of comparative case studies, North Korea is a country that we've seen leverage cybercrime very, very effectively as a way of generating funds and accessing crypto assets, primarily by attacking and hacking certain crypto asset exchange platforms. That actually, over the past couple of weeks, we saw one of the largest crypto instances of cyber criminality ever, involving a hack of a decentralized finance protocol called the Ronin Bridge, which was hacked by North Korean associated Lazarus Group. And that was a $625 million hack of that protocol, which is a nice haul for a sanctioned and a cash-strapped actor like North Korea. There's been a lot of concern that not only are there not non-state actors in Russia who are engaged in cybercrime, but that Russia might look to ramp up its cybercriminal activity in the face of sanctions, and part of its asymmetrical aggressive activities targeting the West, might even attack financial infrastructure. Certainly, there's a playbook there that North Korea has laid down for how to access crypto assets using cybercrime. So that's another method we're watching. And lastly, Lawrence has referred to us already, but the potential use of non-compliant exchange services and other virtual asset service providers, especially those who are located in high-risk jurisdictions that may not implement standards, such as those that have been set out by the Financial Action Task Force. Not those, primarily, I think, in countries like the US or the European Union or the UK, where, again, there is a level of compliance, but especially those in countries where there may not be regulation around crypto assets, potentially even crypto asset exchanges in Russia itself, that could be conduits for sanctions evasion activity. And so those are a number of things we're monitoring through our work at Elliptic. But I think that's a helpful segue into some of the work that FinCEN has done. So I wanted to turn to Kevin there to talk about what was a really, I thought, very interesting and great piece of work FinCEN did in March, where FinCEN released an advisory on Russian sanctions evasion, which included red flags of potential sanctions evasion involving crypto assets or virtual currencies. So, Kevin, can you potentially explain, firstly, FinCEN's perspective on this question of potential Russian sanctions evasion and what that might mean, but also why FinCEN chose to publish that advisory, and what its expectations are for the businesses it regulates when it comes to making use of that information.
Yeah, thank you, David. One of the things that I think is really important sort of to establish as a baseline here is, this is a regulated industry, right? So FinCEN has been in this space sort of asserting that the crypto industry and virtual asset service providers have some sort of anti-money laundering obligation, basically since we revised the definition of money transmission services in 2011 and issued our guidance in 2013 saying that, this activity, when you're using virtual assets, it meets the definition of money transmission services. You have obligations under the United States, under the Bank Secrecy Act, and there are certain requirements that we expect you to meet. We've been examining financial institutions with our delegated examiners at the IRS since 2014. We've been taking enforcement actions since 2015 on noncompliance, and sort of building this up to show that, and putting guidance out in addition to that, to sort of give people the information they need to make decisions about compliance and how to meet their expectations here. And I sort of set that up as a framework because I think that regulatory framework of compliance in the AML space really feeds into what we're seeing here and what should be in place to sort of guard against this activity. Because as you correctly pointed out, one of my big concerns in this space is, we have these sort of conflicting messages here, right? We have, look, crypto at large right now is not being used whole scale for sanctions evasion. I think, we can sort of agree on that. We've said that in our alerts and our advisories. But at the same time, one of the biggest compliance challenges you have here is complacency. And, when people start pushing that message out that there's no crypto, we're not seeing it right now, people can often think that that's not something they need to focus on from a compliance standpoint. And I think that would be a huge, huge mistake here. As you correctly said just now, David, people are oligarchs when they start reaching a choke point, when they can't use those traditional finance means to access the financial system anymore, are going to continually seek out new ways to try to move their money through different ways. These what we've been calling cryptogarchs are going to try to increasingly use large-scale virtual currency transactions to try to move it. It might not be happening now. It's something to look for in the future. And that's why we put out the alerts that we did at the timing we did for this space. So if you look at the alert that we put out several alerts. There's the first one that was specifically on sanction evasion that had the crypto red flags. And we also did one right after that on high-value assets, real estate, and things like that. Implying that there's multiple avenues here. But the crypto red flags were really focused on those non-compliant exchanges and identifying high-risk jurisdictions that might not have the appropriate controls and oversight in place in them. So really what we're trying to highlight here is people using jurisdictional arbitrage to find a weak point in the system to move this kind of crypto activity. It's a huge concern for us. It's been a huge concern at Treasury. And I think that's reflective in both the actions that OFAC's taken from the designations and from the compliance and enforcement side, but also from FinCEN. I mean, if you remember in 2017, we worked as a whole of government approach to shut down the Russian exchange BTCE because it was the primary money laundering concern, for lack of a better word, that existed at the time that all the laundering was going through. So at the time, that had 95% of all ransomware going through one exchange. That's the same thing we're on guard for now. We want to find, the actors are going to keep testing the system to try to find the weak points in the system that they can exploit. And it's the responsibility of the compliant financial institutions to look for those weak points and identify opportunities where they can prevent that from taking place, from reporting it to the government as appropriate, and working with law enforcement and regulators to have a more resilient financial institution system. I've seen a bunch of questions come in from the Q&A asking about particular jurisdictions and how people are using, might be exploiting that. I think those are the exact right questions to ask when you're building a compliance program and taking a risk-based approach. Where are the weak points you see that these like cryptogarchs might use to try to exploit weaknesses in the system, and how are you building a compliance program that targets geography in an appropriate way, that targets high-risk exchanges in an appropriate way, and uses the publicly available information that folks like Lawrence have from their team when they publish it and make it available to increase your reporting and increase your surveillance of the system to make yourself more resilient.
No, thanks. And I think it is a very important call and reminder of the need for vigilance, because I think you are right. It can be easy for people to look at the headlines and draw certain conclusions and become complacent, something we don't want to see. And so definitely recommend to anyone who's listening today, if you haven't already read the FinCEN advisories on Russian red flags, definitely do so. They're very informative and helpful documents. And we'll also say, Kevin, thank you for coining the term cryptogarchs. I'm going to use that one for sure. That's a great one. So thank you for that. But you alluded to it a bit, but can we perhaps talk about the importance of SAR filings in detecting a lot of this type of activities? How useful is FinCEN already finding SAR filings from, say, the crypto asset sector in enabling it to detect illicit activity and sanctions evasion? And what are the types of indicators or information in SARs about crypto assets that are most useful for FinCEN to receive from the private sector?
Yeah, and this is the classic question we love at FinCEN, right? Like talking about the data that we're receiving from financial institutions and what we're working on. And I think Lawrence said it really well when he was talking about the SDN designations up front is, all of these publicly available resources, these addresses, those lookbacks that you're able to conduct based on that, all feed into this intelligence cycle that make for better filings that give us more intelligence in what we're, that's out there. So I think, SARs are an invaluable tool, not just for law enforcement and for regulators trying to identify where this money is going, but the thing that I think isn't talked about when you're looking at SARs is building out typologies and methodologies. We have a very, very sharp intelligence team in our intelligence division that really focuses exclusively on crypto and emerging technologies, and takes all of the SARs that come in this space and does really in-depth analysis on it. And they're able to build out methodologies and typologies based on the filings that financial institutions have that guide law enforcement and guide my team and Lawrence's team, places where we should be looking, where there might be weak points in the financial system. That all comes in from financial institution reporting in this space. I think it's often talked about, we like to talk about how crypto filing has changed over time. I mean, since 2012, we've received over 230,000 SARs on cryptocurrency, right? So those are cryptocurrency specific SARs from over 4,500 different unique filers. And what's most important about that, I think, is that the largest set of unique filers filing on crypto activity are the virtual asset service providers themselves. So the biggest component of people reporting illicit crypto activity are the financial institutions that you would expect to see that sort of reporting from. And I think that is a really important thing that's often overlooked in this space. In 2021 alone, I think we received over 92,000 crypto SARs, and that reported over $96 billion worth of activity. So really invaluable information that's coming through. I mean, my biggest pet peeve on the SAR space is everybody's like, well, I don't necessarily see a prosecution based on every SAR that I'm filing. And I think that's just so misleading, because what people miss when they look at it from a one prosecution to one SAR filing is these methodologies and typologies that are built out are so invaluable to how government is able to look at problem sets like Russian sanction evasion that it's often missed. And so to that end, I would say, crypto-specific and cyber-specific indicators as part of the SAR field are always going to be really important. We modified the SAR in 2016 to allow for reporting of things like IP addresses and timestamps and a lot of different types of indicators that we can get, from wallet addresses, transaction hashes, malware signatures, all things that can be reported to us that are invaluable when we do research in this space. I'd also remind everyone, narratives are really critical. SAR narratives are an excellent way to tell your story about why a transaction is suspicious. It's always going to be important to us. And remember, there's an attachment field. So that CSV file you can attach with your SAR filing is going to be really, really important when you can provide all these crypto indicators that we might be able to use to do the analysis ourselves. And then finally, I'd say, we use keywords in our alerts. So when you're seeing specific activity, if you include those keywords, it makes it so much easier for our analysts to be able to find and identify specific transactions related to us. It really, really helps us hone in to what we're seeing in the space.
No, thanks for that. That's super helpful, and I think just really valuable takeaways there for the audience there in terms of really actionable and quite rich takeaways that they can think about in terms of how to make sure they're adding that value for FinCEN and help you all do your job. Maybe in just a couple of minutes we'll turn to questions from the audience to make sure we have time for those. But I guess just kind of as a closing thought, before we turn to those audience questions, we have talked a lot about the obligations themselves, the potential for sanctions evasion, SAR filing obligations. Obviously there's a lot here for businesses in the private sector to operationalize. When it comes to so the compliance processes and controls they put in place, what are some of the really things you'd like to see that the private sector prioritizing at this moment to really make themselves as resilient as possible against prospective Russian sanctions evasion? Lawrence, maybe we can start there from your perspective, and then we'll take Kevin's view on that too.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And I think at a high level, the controls we would expect in the Russia context are very similar to what we'd expect really to prevent sanctions evasion writ large, right? And so what I would first do is look to the virtual currency compliance brochure that we issued last year, which starts with the premise that firms should take a risk-based approach, right? So in the Russia context, what that means is that they should understand their exposure to Russia, where the potential linkages may be, whether it's the customers, the transactions, the products, the geographic location. Those are some of the things that firms want to consider when they determine, what their risk is and what controls they would want to put in place to mitigate that risk. Now, in the compliance brochure, we identified some concrete best practices that firms should take a look at. And so what I would suggest is looking at those best practices and then tailoring them specific to the risk and exposure that firms may have in the Russia context, right? So for example, we talk about the use of geolocation tools to identify and prevent IP addresses that originate in, right? So one concrete example in this space is that there's a new executive order prohibiting the export of services to the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic regions of Ukraine. Now, those requirements are very similar to the requirements that we have imposed with respect to Crimea, right? So one thing firms can do is use the controls that they have in place with respect to Crimea and apply them to those regions as well. It's just one example of how you can take the best practices and tailor them specific to the Russia context. A couple other best practices that we highlight that we think are relevant here too is adopting know your customer procedures and obtaining information about the customers during the onboarding and throughout the customer relationship, right? That's very important information, and use that to assess the risk of customers, to identify potential suspicious activity, including potential evasion. You may also want to examine customer transaction history, right, to see if there's any connections to sanctioned jurisdictions or with digital currency addresses that we may have listed, going back to that point about using the digital currency address information to inform the risk. And again, using the information that we provide and that FinCEN provides to conduct historic lookbacks to identify additional risk that can help inform the controls that you'd put in place. Now, each of these best practices really does depend on the specific risk profile of a particular business. So there is no one-size-fits-all compliance program that everyone can just take, cut and paste, and apply it to their program. It really doesn't work that way. Firms really need to understand what their risk is. And so in the Russia context, it's really assessing what the exposure is to Russia, and then designing the controls to mitigate that particular risk.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback off, just going right into that, David.
Oh, great, thanks, Lawrence. And yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, no, look, one of the reasons I'm really excited to be doing this panel with Lawrence is because I think people don't often appreciate the synergy between, OFAC sanctions compliance and traditional AML CFT. And I think it's always very telling to me when I'm on an examination, when I'm doing an investigation, one of the first things I can tell when I go into a financial institution is I can ask them, how are you complying with OFAC sanctions? I'm not going to bring an action on that, but a response to that and how you're doing that screening is very telling about how a financial institution's overall compliance program is going to be built. Because if you're not at a fundamental level able to demonstrate compliance with, with your OFAC SDN and OFAC jurisdiction obligations, there's a very high probability there are other things wrong with your policies, procedures, and internal controls because that's just so fundamental to your overall compliance program. So I think understanding that there's not just OFAC risk when you're looking at Russian sanctions evasion. There's an overall AML compliance problem here that needs to be, really fundamentally assessed as part of your risk assessment, looking at those geographical indicators, looking at the products and services that you're going to offer. So, risks associated with geography, it's Russian exposure, it's other sanctioned jurisdictions exposure, high-risk jurisdictions identified by FinCEN, identified by FATF. There's a lot of other considerations about that jurisdictional arbitrage that I talked about before, where people are going to try to exploit weaknesses in the system to use your financial institution to try to get around sanctions, and you need to be mindful of that. I'd also say one of our points that are really important here is understanding products and services. So, look, fundamentally, if you don't understand the products and services on your platform, regardless of what they are, you're going to have compliance challenges, and they're absolutely true in the virtual asset space. Not all virtual assets have the same level of transparency. So if you're not building compliance controls around the different types of selective transparency of certain virtual assets, there are going to be compliance challenges with that. So if you're not able to do the same kind of tracing using a tool like Elliptic on certain kinds of assets, I'm going to ask you how you're doing that tracing. How are you making sure that you meet your OFAC obligations, that you meet your broader AML goals? Those are really fundamental questions. Whether you're using Bitcoin or a certain kind of ERC20 token, or an anonymity-enhanced cryptocurrency like Monero, there are different challenges associated with that. And again, when we're talking about cryptogarks, that source of funds screening, understanding where your customer's source of funds are. If the source of funds is from an SDN designated address, and that's not a red flag, that's probably going to be very problematic. But you should be looking at, the same kind of source of funds analysis that you do traditionally for your customers. What do you need to do, and what needs to be enhanced due diligence on top of that to sort of build that out? So I think, you're talking to enforcement people. I think the natural message is, these are things that we're going to be looking for. And when companies are identified to be willfully violating this conduct, there are going to be consequences for that. And I would not be surprised if you see that and there is future action on that space.
And if I could add, because I thought Kevin had a really good point about understanding who your customers are. I think that's very important for sanctions compliance. And part of that too is understanding where your customers are. One of the compliance deficiencies that we've seen in the crypto space is firms not understanding exactly where their customers are coming from. And then you can have individuals in Iran or North Korea, et cetera, that could be using the platform, right? And that could be cause for a sanctions violation. So really understanding who your customers are, but also where they are is very important from a sanctions compliance.
Great, thanks so much both for that. And we do have about 10 minutes remaining. So Brian, maybe I'll hand it back to you so we can take a few questions from the audience before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would like to thank the audience for some great knowledge sharing in the chat too. I see people have been answering each other's questions. They've been providing some insight. So well done. I know we have, we have subject matter experts on the panel, but we also have subject matter experts in the audience. So appreciate you sharing that knowledge. Just a reminder, if you haven't been keeping an eye on the chat, Kevin and David and others have been sharing some great resources there. I'll throw one in here too. That is OFAC's Consolidated Frequently Asked Questions. I find this to be a really useful resource. It's one page that's every single question and answer on the FAQs there, and you can Control F and search for your term and find your FAQ. So really a pretty cool thing. It's very simple, but it's effective. So check that chat. A lot going on in there. One question that came in was on the ransomware side. And one of our attendees was wondering about ransomware groups. And David, maybe I'll ask you for your thoughts on this, and then Lawrence, Kevin, feel free to chime in with any thoughts. There's been a lot of focus on ransomware, including Russian-related ransomware campaigns, but lately the sanctions have focused more on the cash out side. We mentioned a bunch of exchanges, Suex, Garantex, Hydra, rather than the groups themselves. Do we see any likelihood for further focus on these groups? And interesting question, David, maybe from your perspective, is what happens when these groups rebrand? A lot of times they set up shop as a different organization, but from a cryptocurrency tracing perspective, that doesn't necessarily remove the line of sight into their activity. So any thoughts on that front, on the subject of the ransomware groups out there and activity we might see from them?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a great question. And I think, from our perspective, I think as you do notice, there have been some actually great successes recently, to take down parts of the cybercriminal and ransomware infrastructure and ecosystem, like the takedown and sanctioning of Hydra a couple of weeks ago, which is a huge blow, I think, to some of these networks. Now, obviously, a lot of these networks do tend to reconstitute themselves, or those members who aren't apprehended or subject to law enforcement action may try to find other ways to stand up new dark place markets or sort of stand up new ransomware activities. But as you noted, the transparency of crypto assets can sometimes be an asset for us in understanding that activity, because we might see that some of these groups, say, for example, will continue to rely on addresses they've used in the past, or may try to move funds that have been associated with previous criminal activity, and so we can sometimes map and follow their activity through the blockchain to understand about what they're doing, even subsequent to some of these actions that may attempt to disrupt them. But I do think the fact that these groups often do tend to reconstitute themselves is a really great reason why it's so important to focus some of the sanctions action and regulatory activity on these high-risk exchanges that are facilitating business on behalf of these networks. Because overwhelmingly, what we see at Elliptic is that criminal actors of many stripes will tend to launder their funds repeatedly through many of the same high-risk exchange services. So we saw this with BTCE, which Kevin mentioned before. We saw this with Garantex and Suex and Chautex, these other high-risk exchanges OFAC has sanctioned. They're doing business for many criminal actors. These are nodes of real vulnerability, and so I think by targeting them, I think OFAC has done a really great thing in that it's going to make these networks harder for them to operate. But it is always a game of evolution and working to stay ahead of those networks. And I mean, we've identified a large number of exchange services either based in or servicing Russia. And so, there will definitely be continued attempts by these actors to leverage those types of services. But yeah, certainly my perspective.
And I would agree with that, David. From our perspective, disrupting the infrastructure for ransomware continues to be a top priority. And so on the OFAC side, obviously sanctions is a major component of that, but it's not the only tool that the U.S. government uses, right? But from the sanctions side, I think you hit the nail on the head, David, that targeting these nodes where they're sort of the common node that can be used for multiple ransomware or other illicit activity has really been effective. And so that's why we've been taking action against Hydra, Chadex, Suex. As well as the other thing we did late last year is update our enforcement advisory on ransomware specifically to really emphasize the point about implementing appropriate cyber hygiene, as well as the importance of cooperating and disclosing the information to law enforcement, which is also something that we emphasize in the ransomware space.
Excellent. Thanks to you both for that one. Another interesting question here on the this is a point you alluded to, Lawrence and Kevin, earlier on the compliance program side, that it's really not that different from, on the crypto side from what you might see on the traditional financial institution side. One of our attendees is wondering, where do you see kind of common gaps or deficiencies in KYC, CDD, and sanctions programs? And do you see this differ between your traditional FI space and your crypto businesses in general? We're not naming names here, but just any sort of general trends you've noticed of sort of weak points, and are those the same between the crypto world and the traditional finance or TradFi I've heard it referred to world? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think, there's a great, you see, probably more than any other type of financial services, you're seeing a lot of disparity between people who have really sharp compliance programs that are top of the line that I think would give a lot of traditional finance people a run for their money about, top of the line stuff, and then some real disregard for overall activity that's going on there, and there's a lot in between there. I think as I talked to sort of in my prior comments, some of the things we're seeing is a couple things I'd see in best of line things are transaction review. How are you looking at transactions that take place through your platform? When are you doing due diligence on customers and their wallets? Are you doing periodic reviews? Remember, if you have a tool like Elliptic or something like that, information is constantly being added to blockchain analytic tools and blockchain analysis, right? We have an immutable public ledger. That's unlike other type of financial services where you continually have more information to act on. How are you using that new information as it gets into your program to do your due diligence and review customer account activity and where your exposure might be? That's very different than traditional finance, and it's an advantage you have to have more compliance at your fingertips. The other thing I'd say is, products and services like I talked about, there are lots of platforms that'll just list coins. That's great. That's your prerogative. But again, not all coins are the same. Can you do analysis on all those coins? Are you able to do the same kind of tracing on all of them? Maybe you can. Maybe that's great. Maybe that's part of your risk assessment. Maybe it's not. And I think that's a really big program gap that could exist in a lot of products and services there. And then I just throw on at the end, foreign located MSBs. They're covered under the BSA if they're doing business in the United States in whole or substantial part. If you're maintaining that you have no U.S. touch point and that you don't have to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act, I would be really, really sure about that because, you would want to, because we have jurisdiction if you're doing business in the United States in whole or substantial part. We've taken action against non-compliant exchanges for failing to meet their obligations here. And particularly if we see Russian sanctions evasion or ransomware or something like that going through that, you can bet that that's going to catch our attention.
So we're at 12 o'clock, so I'll only offer just 2 quick points, which is understanding really, again, where customers are, but also where their counterparties are, I think is very important for firms to understand. And then the last point really to emphasize is we've seen firms get in trouble where they grow at the expense of compliance, right? And so our point there is that compliance really does need to be baked into the architecture as the technology is being developed. And as technology changes, then compliance needs to change with it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think it's a very, what I'm hearing from both of you is this real need for real-time, information in various forms, and also a level of expertise in this space as it is rapidly evolving and new, whether that's product knowledge, compliance knowledge relevant to cryptocurrencies and so forth. I see a comment from Jim Richards is on the line, always the agitator, who's noting that there are many public ledgers, not a single mutable public ledger, and there are many ways to obfuscate potentially funds. And this actually speaks to one more question I'll throw out there. I know we're a couple minutes over time, from one of our attendees that came in earlier, and that was on the tension, I guess you could say, or between crypto transparency and crypto methods to kind of muddy that transparency. And they're saying, I keep hearing that crypto is transparent. I think we mentioned transparency a couple of times on this webinar, but yet in the same conversation, I hear about things like mixers and tumblers and privacy coins and so on and so forth. So can you speak to this kind of, tension between transparency and lack thereof, and what's taking place in the crypto space to maybe pierce, see through some of these ways to obfuscate transactions?
Yeah, I'm sure David has a lot of thoughts on this, but one thing I just say, it is, Mr. Richards is correct. It is multiple public ledgers, but that's exactly my point. I mean, you need to understand that there are different ledgers here with different attributes that you might need to do, and that should be part of your risk assessment. Similarly, we've taken action against mixers. Mixers under our 2019 guidance are generally considered financial institutions and have obligations under the BSA just like anything else. So I think we are trying to tackle some of these problems. And when you're building out a risk assessment for a virtual asset service provider standpoint, these are the types of considerations and exposures that you need to take into consideration when building out that program. David, I'm sure you have thoughts on the tracing elements of this, so I yield to you on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's correctly noted that there are tools like mixers and privacy wallets and technologies like privacy coins that lack transparency, may work to obfuscate some of the transparency. But I think, one of the powerful things about blockchain is we are often able to see where these services are being utilized. So even though a mixing service might break the funds trail, we can see where funds are flowing to one. And private sector entities can leverage that same information to detect red flags, to undertake a risk-based approach around their transaction monitoring, and to use some of that same information to inform SAR filings, like Kevin was talking about before. So I think while there's undoubtedly, and there always will be efforts by criminals to obfuscate what they're doing, I do think many of the tools are there to enable the private sector to play a proactive role in detecting, potential illicit activity using these various methodologies. And I think that's why those resources like FinCEN's published on the advisory side is so great, because those speak to those types of things and make it very clear what you need to be able to detect. And I think, the capability is certainly there to do that.
Yeah, and one more point on the, that's very encouraging on this front is the public and private sector collaboration. We have OFAC here, FinCEN, we have Elliptic who helped to put this together. We have all of you here, most of you, not all of you, but most of you from the private sector. So this speaks to, I think, what I would say a very encouraging, shift in the way we tackle these problems. And I hope that we can continue to bring it forward, both as an association and as a wider financial crime industry. And I just want to say kudos to FinCEN and to OFAC and to Elliptic for this type of collaboration, because it really does. It's really, I think, what people out there have desperately craved for quite some time. So big virtual round of applause to Lawrence and to Kevin and to David for his excellent presentation and moderation. Thanks again to Elliptic, a sincere thanks for helping to make this happen. And thanks to our 800 and some attendees who joined us for this session, and a lot of kudos coming in the chat. I wholeheartedly agree. So I know this has been an extremely busy time, as David said at the beginning, for all of you. And it's just really wonderful that you took the time out of your day to do this. So please fill out the survey at the end of this session. Let us know your thoughts, feedback, topics you would like to see from future sessions. We will grab the information provided, the resources provided in the chat, put those into an email to share with you, since there was a lot of really valuable things there. And with that, we will wrap up for the day. Again, please visit Elliptic's site to learn more about everything they have to offer. Catch some of their webinars. They have some really great knowledge sharing and other resources too. So I definitely encourage you to stay in touch with what Elliptic is doing out there. Have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. And thanks again, everyone. We'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.
Thank you all. Good
Right
seeing
on.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.